Good evening, everybody. My name is Philip Kennedy, and I direct the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute's public program. I'm very happy to welcome you here this evening to our program, which is entitled Shadow Money, Shadow Parties and the Future of American Democracy, with Professor Heather Gerken, who is J. Skelly Wright Professor of Law at Yale University. But I will let my colleague Jules Coleman say a bit more about Professor Gerken in just a minute. I'm actually going to introduce Jules. What I'm really doing is welcoming him back to the NYU Institute podium stage, whatever it is. Although the last time he spoke was at Menara to Saadiyat, where he interviewed, I'm sure a lot of you were there, Jim Traub on aspects of foreign policy. I think the title was his engagement over in the light of the re-election of President Obama. I suppose it's worth saying that, at the Institute we do like to do a lot of things that are very global in perspective, international in perspective, interdisciplinary in perspective, but we do also acknowledge the fact that this NYU, whether it be NYU New York or NYU Abu Dhabi, is an American institution. So we suffer or we are affected by the paradox of American parochialism, which is to say that we have to acknowledge the fact that if you say anything important about America, then you're saying something important about the world. In any case, Jules Coleman, Professor Coleman, is Senior Vice Provost at NYU, and he's recently joined staff at NYU Abu Dhabi. He's Professor of Philosophy at NYU Abu Dhabi and New York, and also Professor of Law. He's been at NYU for 10 years, and prior to that, he was the Wesley Newcomb Hofeld Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and Professor of Philosophy at Yale. He has also taught at the University of California, the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, and the University of Arizona. He is the author of a number of books and articles, but most notable among his writings are Risks and Wrongs, and the practice of principle in defense of a pragmatist approach to legal theory. Both of these books have been extremely feted and have had conferences convened around them. I think the latest one was in Catalonia in the winter, if I'm not mistaken. Jules Coleman is one of the most respected philosophers and legal theorists around, and he has already been feted with 3 Festschrifts, so I think that says it all. He's a graduate of Rockefeller University, where he received his PhD, Yale, where he received his law degree, and his alma mater is Brooklyn College. So, Jules, it's a great pleasure to welcome you back, and I leave you to say more about Professor Gerken.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip. I appreciate it. It's great to be here. I want to start by saying a couple of things. One is I've really only been at NYU legally for a year. I've been a consultant for 10 years, and you shouldn't say I've been at NYU for 10 years in front of a Yale colleague who may report this back to the dean and ask for my money back, the salary that I had all those years. My personal task here is to be Charlie Rose. My instinct, of course, as those of you who know me know, is to be Steve Colbert, which will not work for a variety of reasons. Because while it's my instinct, it is not my competence. I would have come to NYU 5 years ago, not 10, happily, had it not been for the fact that Yale Law School had hired Heather Gerken away from Harvard. And her presence on the Yale faculty is as much reason as any for my deciding to stay there. She is not only a great scholar, leading expert in the United States on election law, on constitutional law, on political theory of law, and diversity, minorities, federalism, you name it. She is one of the world's great teachers, one of the world's great mentors, and one of the world's great colleagues. So it's a tremendous pleasure for me to have this opportunity to engage in conversation about the American political system with Heather Gerken. But before I begin the conversation and invite you to welcome her on behalf of all of us, I want to add one last thing, which is that in both 2008 and 2012, Heather was essential in the Obama campaign and the group of lawyers. And at some point, perhaps during the conversation, if you'd like, we can switch some of our discussion to explore some of the ways in which the Obama campaign and lawyering, as well as money, figured in the United States election. So please join me in welcoming Heather Gerken to Abu Dhabi this evening. Thank you. So I think we can begin the conversation by talking about a topic that's on everyone's mind in some ways, and that is just the general issue having to do with the alleged corrupting influence of money in politics. As it's such a source of concern for people, the amount of money that is in elections, in addition to the way it's used in elections, but just the amount of it that is sort of naturally thought of as a corrupting influence, and that's something that needs to be regulated. And I thought I'd begin by asking Heather what she thought about the claim that money by itself turns out to be a deeply corrupting influence, and how it should be regulated if in fact it is.
Well, thank you. And I just wanted to say a quick thank you to NYU Abu Dhabi. It has been an unbelievable trip. It must be thrilling for you all to be here. I'm thrilled by it. And I have almost forgiven you for taking Jules away from us now that I've come here and seen what you've brought him to. But so I'll talk a little bit about corruption in money in American politics. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the crazy Wild West system we have in the United States, there are a couple of strange features about American elections that are not true of elections in almost any other developed democracy. So although we go and try to export our democracy constantly, there are things that when I go abroad, I'm a little bit embarrassed to tell you. So here's one of the embarrassing secrets of Americans' elections are not so secret, which is that we pay for our elections privately. Money comes generally not from the state, but from private donors. And it's a huge amount of money. So we spent $7 billion, that's with a B, dollars on the last election. Now, the reason why we worry about the way we fund elections goes back to a Supreme Court case. So Congress, after the Nixon and Watergate scandals, decided to essentially create a fairly sturdy campaign finance system. And it did what every other country in the world does when it wants to create a sturdy campaign finance system. It regulates the money going in, the contributions, and it regulates the money going out, the expenditures, for a simple and obvious reason. Well, the Supreme Court of the United States decided that for purposes of the First Amendment, you could not regulate them in the same way. That it was fine to cap what are called contributions, the money you give to a candidate, but it's not okay to cap what the candidate spends, the expenditure piece of it. And that one decision has profoundly shaped American politics for reasons that I'm sure you can guess. One of my colleagues describes it, the way that we regulate input but not output. It's as if you took a giant fat man and put him in front of a beautiful all-you-can-eat buffet and said, you can have as much as you want, as long as you serve yourself with a teaspoon. So what happens when you ask the fat man to serve himself with a teaspoon? Well, he begins to stuff things in his pocket and find other ways to get the food onto his plate. And that's exactly what American politics has done. So as soon as politicians began to compete against one another, they wanted to spend more. In order to spend more, they wanted to find loopholes. And so they eventually began to find loopholes in the system and then began to drive large trucks of money through those loopholes. As a result, spending in the United States is often unregulated, extremely hard to trace, and done entirely privately. So why do we worry about that? We worry about that because of corruption. Now, not the corruption that most people think about when they think, for example, about Chicago politics, where a big bag of money lands on your doorstep and then you give a vote the next day. It's not what we call quid pro quo corruption. You give me money and I'll give you a vote. It's more subtle than that. It's the money that goes into funding your election. You give me money, I will get elected, and then maybe I'll give you a vote. It's pervasive in our system in a variety of ways. So one way is simply that the special interests that are able to aggregate the money more effectively have a huge impact on the way politicians vote, particularly in the hidden context, the votes that nobody sees. So on the big issues, politicians are going to vote the way they think they need to vote to get reelected. But on the huge number of smaller issues, which include loopholes and tax treatments and lobbying, the politicians pay attention to where the money is. That's the kind of corruption that we worry about. And the reason why it's so difficult to regulate is that it's subtle. So how do we know if this politician tried to help GE get a deal because he believes that GE getting a deal is going to help the United States or help his state, or whether it's actually because GE was lining the pocket of his campaign coffers? So that's the dilemma of the United States, is the regulation. The other real problem in the United States is those loopholes. So one way to describe the way that Congress has regulated over the past 20-odd years is they've played this carnival game called whack-a-mole. Anyone played whack-a-mole? It's where you sort of see a game, these little moles come up, you try to hit them with a hammer, and you miss it, you hit one, and then another one pops up here. Kids love it. It's not a particularly effective regulatory strategy. So every time Congress closes a loophole, every time God closes a window, a window opens up for politicians. They find some other loophole. And so the story of American politics and corruption in American politics is the story of chasing that money as it moves through the loopholes.
Now, how does this differ in your, if you're knowledgeable about it, from the way elections are generally funded elsewhere in the world?
Well, elsewhere in the world, people regulate both contributions and expenditures. They don't spend nearly as much on their elections on average, and the money is usually coming from the public fisc, or it comes in a heavy regulated and transparent fashion, which is all very reassuring if you worry about the effect of money on politics. What has been most notable is also the change in the way money has been regulated just in the last few years in the United States. So it used to be, it was reasonably easy to figure out who was spending the money. And if you know who's spending the money, you feel like you at least have some handle on where the corruption paths lie. But now we're at a point where immense quantities of money are being put into the system to influence elections without us having any idea who's spending that money at all. So for example, there's a group called Crossroads GPS, which at some point announced it was going to spend $500 million with a B dollars on the presidential election. And that money was completely from invisible sources. It could have been one person, it could have been 50 people, it could have been 50 Fortune 500 companies. We just don't know, and no one is willing to give us the information. So even at that basic level of transparency, we don't know where the money is coming from for much of the money that runs through American elections nowadays.
So what about, if I just thought about it this way, if I were a large corporation or I had special interests of a certain sort, why would I just, this is a side question to the main question, but it always strikes me, I should ask someone who would have an answer, because I don't have an answer. Why wouldn't I give money to both parties, both candidates? Why wouldn't I line both pockets? I mean, that is, it's a slightly risk-averse strategy, but it guarantees a certain kind of success.
Yes, well, in fact, you do see corporations often giving to both candidates, which is a very interesting thing, because the whole point, one would think about giving money, if it really matters under the First Amendment, if money has expressive dimensions, you think you'd root for one side or another. That rooting for both sides doesn't seem a particularly political thing to do, but it is a sound financial thing to do. So if you're a well-heeled corporation, you do three things. The first thing that you do is give money to both sides when you think both sides are capable of winning. The second thing you do is you spend a lot of money on lobbying, that is sending people to behind the scenes to negotiate bills, because a huge amount of the deals that are done by lobbyists. But the third thing you do nowadays is you put your money into these nonprofits that no one can trace. Because in the old days, people knew who you were giving it to. That's why you wanted to give it to both sides. But now, if you think, for example, that the Democrats have regulated Wall Street too heavily, you give to the Republicans. And the Democrats will never know that you're giving to them because that money is now virtually untraceable. A perfect example is even for influencing outcomes in legislation. The healthcare industry, during the big healthcare bill that was passed in the last few years in the United States, purported to stay out of the fight. They said, well, we're not going to get in the middle of this fight. We're not political. We're going to let American politics work these questions out. In fact, they were pouring millions and millions of dollars into something called the Chamber of Commerce, which is nominally to promote small business. And the Chamber of Commerce was buying giant ads attacking the bills that were being put up. So it's a very quiet, subtle way of getting the work done you want to get done without anyone being able to trace it.
So a follow-up question might be, it strikes me that the money is more likely to be effective, more efficient at local levels rather than at federal levels, but the emphasis of worry and concern and the source of all the publicity is the federal level, especially Congress and presidency and so on.
Yeah, I attribute this to the idiocy of academics and progressive reform groups. There are two groups that are just often isolated from reality in the sense. So they have this idea that the federal government is going to ride in on a giant white horse and save us from ourselves. Now that would require Congress to do something. And for those of you who are familiar with what's been going on in Congress lately, the answer is nothing. You could leave and go to Abu Dhabi for 3 years and Congress would not pass a single piece of legislation. You would not miss anything. It has become, we call it the least dangerous branch. That used to be true of what we called the courts, but now Congress is the least dangerous branch because it doesn't do anything. So the real problem and the real experimentation is happening at the state level right now. Because at the state level, it's actually much cheaper to buy an election. Because it doesn't cost nearly as much as at the federal level. And there's just even things like we have judicial elections in many parts of this country. So you can
buy a judge.
You can buy a judge. And there are ways in which interest groups that are heavily invested in one outcome or another of a piece of litigation will fund the campaign of one judge or another. So it's hidden and it's a lot cheaper to get your work done.
Okay, so the main body of the discussion is about shadow parties and their relationship to political parties that we know and the way money is connected to the two. So one place to begin is by asking, what is a shadow party?
Right, so before 2008, we saw the rise of what's called independent expenditures, and I think we'll probably talk about whether they're independent or not. But an independent expenditure is something that's not done through a party or a candidate. So it's Joe Schmo putting $50 in and buying an ad in the newspaper for his favorite candidate. He doesn't do it through the party. He doesn't consult with the party. He just buys what he wants to do. It's a purely expressive act. That's the way we're supposed to think about it. Independent expenditures have become an increasingly important part of American politics, but it's not done by Joe Schmo anymore. It's done by extremely wealthy individuals and corporations. And they buy advertisements for candidates and have a tremendous impact on the election. So it used to be that we thought that the independent expenditures were going to irritate politicians at some point. It was this dark money is what it's called. The dark money would drive politicians crazy. So why would politicians be unhappy? Because the one thing politicians like to be in is in control. They like to be in control of their message. They don't like crazy millionaires buying ads about issues they don't want to talk about. So if you're an American politician, you are not interested in anyone buying an ad about guns or abortion or immigration. You want people to buy ads that show you talking to the steel worker or doing whatever is on message you want. So there was a view prior to 2008 that eventually the politicians would start to regulate the dark money because they would be so irritated by this the money being spent where they didn't have control of it that they'd try to push it back into the party system. That was the conventional wisdom. It turns out the conventional wisdom was flatly wrong. What has happened instead of what we predicted in 2008, the money hasn't been driven into these shadowy organizations in the sense of not connected to the party. It's been delivered to shadow parties. So what we see springing up next to the regular party is a shadow party. And so what do I mean by a shadow party? I mean it's an organization that is as closely intertwined with the party itself as you can imagine. So people who are campaign managers for a candidate then go and organize what's called a super PAC, the independent organization. So one day, you're running the campaign, and the next day, you're raising money for an independent organization to help the campaign. You see these super PACs and independent organizations running the same ads as the politicians that they're allegedly independent of. There was this great moment when a super PAC ran the same ad as a candidate, And so someone said, doesn't that look like you're coordinating? You're part of the same organization? They said, oh, no. It just so happened that the advertising agency we both were using had an ad line around. We both thought it was good, so we both ran it. So there's an extraordinary level of coordination between the parties and the shadow parties. My favorite moment being when Newt Gingrich, during the Republican primary, actually told his super PAC to stop running a particular ad because, of course, it's completely independent. Or there's a great building in Alexandria, Virginia, which just gives lie to the myth that these things are separate. So in Alexandria, Virginia, in a room about as big as this, there are 3 offices. One is the office of the Romney campaign. One is the office of the Romney Super PAC. And one was the office of Karl Rove's nonprofit independent organization. They were all in the same office. But it gets uglier because the chair of the part of the campaign and the person who was running the Super PAC were married to one another. But of course, never discussed anything at all that would involve coordinating or passing messages between the campaign.
Well, that
or
sounds like a marriage.
Right, right. So the husband admitted that this sounded, at some point, he became cursed with self-awareness and admitted to a reporter that this sounded kind of ridiculous. But then he turned around and showed that he, in fact, was not as cursed with self-awareness as one might think and said, but don't worry about the Karl Rove organization because, there's a big glass conference room between their office and ours, so it must be independent.
Well,
so those parties are integrated along every dimension. So now if you're a candidate, you're not worried about these crazy organizations. You've got your shadow party. You can have your cake and eat it too. You raise all the money you want for your party, and then your guys are raising all the money you could possibly want for your campaign as well. It's a perfect system if you're a politician.
I couldn't help but thinking that while they were probably in the same office building, they probably also had bank accounts in the same bank in Bermuda or the Bahamas,
well, they were wise
adjacent to one another.
Yeah, especially given the campaign loss, they're going to need that money.
Right. But what's interesting is why would the independents who had this message that they wanted to convey, why would they give up their authority to do that and the freedom to do that and turn it over to the super PACs?
Yeah, so I think one way to understand it is, and this is a lawyer's game, lawyers think you can regulate stuff. So they think there's this thing called a party, which is like a chair or a table, right? There's something there, and you can regulate it, and it doesn't change in any way. Now, anyone who's, of course, familiar with corporations knows that corporations can shift form all the time. Parties are just like that. So parties are a loose agglomeration of a variety of interests who gather together to put policy and candidates forward. So it's very easy for them to reorganize when you start to regulate in ways they don't like. They're shapeshifters. So if you try to shut them down in one direction, just as the money appears elsewhere, so does power. Just an example, the greatest and probably most important party reform in the United States happened in the wake of a variety of controversies in the 1960s involving smoke-filled rooms. So it used to be, in fact, that we chose candidates in smoke-filled rooms in conventions. Now, for any of you who's younger than 100, right, you probably think conventions are just those really completely staged Disneyland sort of events where the candidate gets up and everyone talks about how wonderful he is. It used to be people made decisions at the convention in these smoke-filled rooms, and the party elites would get together and they'd pick a candidate. So what happens? They decide to make it democratic. They decide to allow the people in the party faithful, the electorate, to actually choose who is going to be running against one another. And so these are radical reforms that were designed to turn the party system upside down and democratize it. But the lesson of party regulation is that the empire always strikes back. So what did the party elites do? Eventually, the party elites figured out how to game the system and exercise almost as much control as they used to in the smoke-filled room. So just to give you a statistic, in the last 25 years, the Republicans have only run one candidate who is not the choice of the party elite, and that was John McCain, who was actually kind of a conventional-looking Republican, but they hated him because he always criticized the Republican Party. The insiders loathed him for being a traitor. Barack Obama is one of the rare Democratic candidates who was not the chosen elite candidate. That was Hillary Clinton in 2008. And the Democrats are a little more fractious and a little bit more disorganized, so they do this more often. But over the last 25 years, you can count on one hand the number of candidates who were elected during this completely democratic primary process by who wasn't the candidate of the party elite. So why was that? Are the party elites particularly good at choosing and anticipating what the people are going to do? No. The party elites are controlling and affecting what the party ultimately chooses.
And how do they do it?
So how do they do it? So here's how they do it. There's something called an invisible primary. So if you watch politics in the United States, what you'll notice is...
Can I tell you something for a second? You are taking all the fun out of the experience of watching an election. Because...
this is the best part.
Yeah, but I mean, we lived in this wonderful fantasy of every day turning on MSNBC or CNN or Fox. Nah, maybe not Fox, but turning it on and kind of getting, what issue is on the ground in South Carolina and who's speaking to whom.
None of that matters.
It all matters.
No, I mean, this is the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of politics, right? The stuff that's really going on behind the scenes. Power is what matters. So how does power work in the invisible primary? Party elites start to give out endorsements. So, you always probably wonder, why does so-and-so care that such and such a person in Iowa is endorsing her? It's because that's one of the party elites and they're sending a signal. So the party elites start to give out endorsements. The money follows the endorsements. And what follows the money? Boots on the ground, campaign staff, advertisements, all the things you need to make an impression on the voters. So the invisible primary is extremely accurate. It works extremely well, and it gives the elites almost as much power as they had before the radical reforms of 1968, which is
So it's all
remarkable.
signaling behavior.
It's all signaling and cueing behavior, and it works really well.
God, I feel so stupid.
But it happens everywhere. So, I mean, anyone here from Wisconsin? So Wisconsin's like such a sweet state filled with really, to imagine Wisconsin's the world's nicest people. I mean, they're incredible.
No, the world's nicest people are Canadians.
Well, no, right. The Canadians are also in Wisconsin. So, they're just good governance, good people. But Wisconsin, in the early first half of the 19th century, they were, in the 20th century, they regulated the parties. Because they were good governance, right? They said, we don't want the parties to do all this terrible stuff involving money and politics and things, so they regulated the parties heavily. And the party elites looked at those regulations and said, fine. And they formed a private association and did everything that they were going to do anyway. It had no effect whatsoever because they're shapeshifters. So that's the dilemma of American politics, and that's what we're seeing with the shadow parties. So a lot of times people make a mistake when they talk about politics because they just follow the money. There's a phrase called the hydraulics of campaign finance reform. The idea is you cut money off one place, water rises to its level and it will go out someplace. But the money is just following power. So you shouldn't think about it as money, the hydraulics of money. It's the hydraulics of power. And you shut down power in one place and it's going to find another outlet. And that's how the shadow parties have developed.
So then the corrupting influence of money is sort of instrumental. It's not the driver.
It's not the driver. It's actually following it.
It's the follower.
Yep.
So it's the follower of the elites to make, and so the question is, why does it follow the elites?
Well, so this is the worry about the money. I mean, there's lots of reasons to worry about money in politics, with corruption being the central one. But what I worry about, and something, I may be wrong, so I'll just tell you, academics don't usually say this, they usually are sure they're right. It could just be that what we see going forward is that parties just have two arms, right? They have the party arm and they have the fundraising arm. And parties do that all the time. They shift their functions. Sometimes they let other groups get out the vote. Sometimes they let other groups do their messaging. So it's not unusual to see that. But here's my worry. My worry is that if all the elites go to where the shadow parties are, that it's going to affect the way American politics works in the following sense. So just Jim Messina was Obama's campaign manager. The guy is a mad genius. He made $90,000 a year when he was working for Obama. If you actually calculated that out per hour, it was roughly 6 cents an hour that he was working. Jim Messina, if Jim Messina had been working for a super PAC or a 501c4, he'd be making 6 figures at least. If you throw in the ad buys, easily he's gonna, move up on that scale. So if you're the Jim Messinas of the world, the really smart political guys, you sort of look at your jobs possibilities. There's the party, where you make no money, and there's the shadow party, where you make a ton of money. So what's happening inside the party? Well, the party is doing all the things that parties typically do. They're selecting candidates, they're framing issues for voters, they're making deals about what positions people are going to take. And what's happening in the shadow parties? They're framing issues for voters, they're putting up candidates, they're making deals for the positions people are going to take. So if there's a shift, if all the power moves to the shadow parties, what's left of the party? Well, there's 2 things that's left of the party. The first is the name, good housekeeping seal of approval. Just like anything else, everyone uses a shorthand. When you go to the grocery store and you see 6,000 cans of tomato soup, right? You pick one because you trust that brand. You don't think about it, you just pick it. Everyone uses shorthand in dating, in all sorts of ways. People just use them to make decisions. Well, the Democrat and Republican are shorthands. Good housekeeping seal of approval. When you vote Democrat, you think you know what you're getting. When you vote Republican, you think you know what you're getting. So the shadow parties are never going to run a candidate themselves. Karl Rove is never going to run his own candidate, much as I think he'd like to. It's always going to be the real party that runs a candidate, that gives you that D or R next to your name that helps voters. But the really important thing I think that parties do is they integrate the elites with the voters. And the way that they do that is through the party faithful. So the party faithful are fondly referred to in my election law class as the crazies, which is a compliment because I like the dirty underbelly of American politics. So these are the people who knock on doors and bring donuts, to a campaign event and drive candidates around and put those slips of papers that drive you crazy on your door to tell you to vote and call you to tell you to vote and call you to tell you to vote and call you to tell you to vote. And they don't get anything out of it other than being part of the party. That is, they're not going to be candidates. They're not the interest groups that are getting deals eventually. They're the people who believe in something. And no one in American politics believes in anything except the party faithful. So they're the people who believe in something. And they really matter in a party. Because what a party does is it takes the cynical elites who just want to get stuff through, and it pairs them with the party faithful who believe in something. And the party faithful put a brake on what the cynics can do. The party faithful also just interact with the cynics in a way, in a day-to-day basis. If you go to a campaign, you'll see paid staffers and non-paid staffers, and they hang out with each other, and they talk to each other, and they influence each other. All those social mechanisms that integrate people exist in the party. They do not exist in the shadow party. And so my worry is if you have faith in the party faithful, and I have a slightly romanticized view of them, then you really should worry about that, because the party faithful are your guys. If you are worried, there's always this dilemma in American politics, who's going to guard the guardian? And so who's going to keep track of the representative and make sure he does what you asked him to do when you voted for him? The answer is the parties, right? The parties are going to make sure that Democrats vote for Democratic projects and Republicans vote for Republican projects. But who's going to guard your guardians? That's the real question. Who's going to keep an eye on the party elites to make sure they're not brokering deals behind the scenes, that they're not going too far, that they're not making deals that the people who voted for them won't accept? That's the party faithful. They're the ones who guard those guardians. And they're not going to be in the shadow parties. And if the center of gravity shifts entirely to the shadow parties, we lose the party faithful.
Well, this is very, very interesting. It leads me to think of a few things. The first thing that I think of is I just learned something, because I always thought the emails I got from Jim Messina were from the Buffalo Springfield or Poco. I thought that he was a musician and not part of the Obama campaign. But is he related to
when you work for the campaign, you start to worry, did Jim Messina really email me? That's
right. Yeah. Well, so in any case,
he is a rock star, just of a different sort.
Yeah. But so the worry is that there seems to be so much dishonesty in this setup. The party faithful are relied upon. They don't really know, they don't get anything out of it other than their relationship to the party, but they are actually, on your view, the people who will be the guardians of the parties, but they're not participating in any way other than emotively. That is, they're expressing their commitment to certain kinds of things. They must be getting an enormous amount of value out of association that doesn't seem, it seems fragile.
Yeah. I actually think, so I think about the party, that's a more idealistic way to think about the party faithful. I think about the party faithful as something akin to Red Sox fans. They root for their team, come bad days and good days. They love their team, they're passionate about it. When their team wins, they feel great. When their team loses, they're depressed. There's just a way in which it's almost tribal. And it is about identity and expression, but less about the kind of abstract expression of your political views and more about who you are and how that identity is intertwined with who you are. I mean, my favorite moment in a class teaching students, I was teaching with Bob Bauer, who wasn't yet the White House counsel, but was Obama's counsel. And we were teaching a class on campaign finance, and one of the students, Bob Bauer is a guy that knows politics. He's been in politics all of his life. And at some point, one of the students said, before my identity as a woman, before my identity as a law student or a Catholic, I'm a Democrat. And Bauer even was surprised by that. But I think that's the way to understand it. It's as much about identity and rooting for a team, and that's what makes politics work. So a lot of times this is where the academics love to talk about deliberation, and it's all about choosing the correct policy and things like that. And that's all true. Politics is in part about debates about policy. But the politics side of it, the circus part of it, is just as important. So people during the Obama and Hillary Clinton primary, it was thrilling, right? And people, there was almost no political space between those two people. There were very, very narrow margins on the policy differences, but they were different, and they were each a stand-in for a way of envisioning the Democratic Party, and that's where the fight was. So all the kind of stories about it and their rivalry were as much about having politicians be these physical stand-ins, these putting a face on policy to make it interesting and exciting and educative.
So it sounds like, when you make the Red Sox analogy, it's like, I'm rooting for the uniform, right? In some way, I'm rooting for the uniform.
You're rooting
Yeah, but you know why I root for the
team.
Yeah. But I'm a Mets fan because I grew up in Brooklyn, and my dad was a baseball player in the Brooklyn Dodger organization. And the Yankees are appalling for these kinds of reasons. And so there's a genetic, historical, social, cultural way in which it's passed on, right? How's it passed on? How's being a party faithful passed on?
Exactly the same way. I mean, so sometimes it's genetic and family, and sometimes then there are the people who want to slay. Then there's the Oedipal piece of it, right? So,
yeah, exactly.
So I am the child
kill
of
your father. You want
right.
to kill your father.
All right, I'm the child of New England Republicans, and they are appalled, frankly, that I often vote with the Democrats and worked for one, heaven forbid. So there's a way in which it's about who you are, choosing who you are, and thinking about what it means to you. And some of that is about policy, but a lot of it is about your just vision of yourself and your world.
Yeah, but I understand that. But just like there are a lot of Mets fans who won't go to the games,
Yeah.
there are a lot of people who identify as Democrats or Republicans who don't necessarily go to the games. That is, the party faithful, the people who are going to the games, no matter how high the ticket prices get.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And sitting in the bleachers.
And they're sitting in the bleachers.
And occasionally getting extremely drunk as they watch it. That's a party. I mean, the party faithful are the heaviest drinkers of anyone I know. So it works. The comparison works along every dimension, Jules, I'm telling you.
So let's switch gears for a second. I'm really worried about, so I was thinking now, okay, it seems like it's a slightly unstable recent development between parties and shadow parties. It's a kind of coalition. They're joined at the hip, but it's not obvious that there's long-term foundational reasons for them having the shape that they do. And the question is, if we wanted to break that up, how would we break it up? Would we want to break it up?
Yeah. I think that there's two ways to break it up. So one is to continue with the whack-a-mole game. So, I mean, one of the reasons why shadow parties have developed is because the FEC, which is the Federal Elections Commission, which after Congress is the least effective organization in all of Washington, they also do nothing. They meet 2 hours a week, and one FEC commissioner allegedly only shows up for those 2 hours, because why would you do anything else? There's nothing else to do. So both Congress and the FEC have failed to regulate these organizations, and they could. So if they wanted to, they could do what they have done with other organizations in the past. They could close the loophole. Now, that doesn't mean another loophole won't open somewhere. But for a while, you can keep the loopholes closed, and it makes a difference. When they regulated soft money, they genuinely shut down soft money for a while until eventually the party elite figured out. So you could play that game, and you could regulate it, particularly by just regulating what it means to be independent. So all of the descriptions I gave you about using the same campaign ads, being in the same office, Stephen Colbert, who in my view has done more for campaign finance than any person since Richard Nixon. Stephen Colbert has this great skit where he has this lawyer who's
By the way, Richard Nixon was the last liberal president.
Yeah, well, he also helped the campaign finance game.
Yeah.
But he had his lawyer talking to both his super PAC and his campaign at the same time. Stephen Colbert was brilliant about these comic sketches, but what made them so brilliant was they were the farce. The facts are the farce. He didn't have to change a word. It was appalling, but funny at the same moment, because that's what the law is. The law is so weak right now. So you could regulate that, is to really put some brakes on what kind of coordination can exist. Or the other thing you can do is you can just hope that American politics churns. Because one of the things that's always true of American politics is that there are internecine wars that take place not just between the parties, but within the parties. So if you want to break the shadow party connection, watch what happens. I mean, it's interesting. So right now the Democrats are fairly united and feeling pretty happy. They've got the incumbent. Everyone's talking as if they're going to win forever and ever, which is not true, but they think it. But the Republicans are struggling. They just got shellacked. Or to quote George Bush, a good thumping at the election. And they're sort of trying to figure out who they are. And the coalition that has long held for the Republican Party is starting to fracture. And you see these independent organizations, these shadow parties, are actually starting to divide and separate from the candidates in some instances. You see primary challenges by other organizations that are independent. So you can imagine that the war within a party might cause these things to split, at least temporarily. But unless you put some legal regulation in, they'll split for a while, but then they're going to come back, because this is just too good a system for the incumbent. Have your cake and eat it too. Have your party and get your money. I mean, it's ideal. You're never going to lose an election, and they don't like to lose elections.
Right. Well, it's kind of interesting. On the story that you're telling, the money is following the elites, but in some ways, you might think that competition among the sources of money can change who the elites are. It can have some influence on the elites. Why is it go in the direction it goes? You can see why it would start in that way.
Yeah.
But when the party is beginning to collapse and fall apart and loses its centralization, that if I'm a person with a source of potential income and have an interest inside the party that is not being well represented, I view this as an opportunity.
Yeah.
Right?
You definitely see some of that, although I'll just say that for the most part, the elites who are the people with money recognize they're smart, right? So that not all people that have money that are smart, not all people that are smart have money, but a lot of the people. I was
just wishing that I could be one of the people who had
both. Money, right? Yeah. Exactly. But the people with money have sort of realized that spending it on their own is not actually going to get them much of a payoff because they don't know what they're doing. I mean, my favorite example is a group called Americans Elect, which wanted to run a third party. And it was basically a bunch of hedge fund quadrillionaires who did it. And they decided they're going to start a third party and they're going to get the name of this party on the ballot everywhere. It was a complete non-starter and failed entirely because they understood the money part, but they didn't understand the politics part. And they couldn't even get a candidate with a name that anyone recognized to run. That's how badly it went for them. So the smart money guys say, who are the smart politics guys? And they give the money to them. And so it's still, the elites still get the money. It's true that they're on the margins. You can try to give it to one kind of smart political elite rather than another. But at the end of the day, you pick your party. It's a big tent, and you know who your guy is. And so you want your party to win, even if it might not be your kind of Republican or your kind of Democrat.
So in the story that we tell that is on television, where I get most of my news and insight.
And your books, right?
Oh yeah, my books, yeah, absolutely.
Made for television movies, I think.
No, I think my books are actually, I sell them with an insomniac's guarantee. That is, you buy one of my books, and if you're having difficulty sleeping, you just pick it up and turn to any page. And if you're not asleep in 10 pages, I give you your money back. And that's not true of every philosophy book, but it's close. But when we tell the story of contemporary American politics and corruption and money, in the press, it's Citizens United.
Yeah.
Citizens United is the devil in this. You don't think so?
You know, this is where the people who do election reform are called the goo-goos, the good governance groups. And they have a really hard life. I mean, every day they get up and they try to pass election reform. And every day they go to bed and they have not succeeded. Because the people who care the most about reform and know the most about reform are the politicians who oppose the reform. And of course, those are the guys you have to get it passed. So the goo-goos have latched on to Citizens United because it's the one part of American politics, regulation that most people think they understand, and they get it completely wrong. So every reporter will tell you that Citizens United unleashed the corporate floodgates, and suddenly there's all this corporate money swishing through the system. It's just false. Any well-heeled corporation could have spent just as much money the day before Citizens United. So just here's the difference between before Citizens United and after for this purpose. If you were a corporation, you wanted to run an ad before Citizens United, you'd run an ad that would say, Chuck Schumer kicks puppies. Call Chuck Schumer, tell him to stop kicking puppies, right? You'd run that. After Citizens United, you can say, Chuck Schumer kicks puppies. Call Chuck Schumer, tell him to stop kicking puppies, and vote against Chuck Schumer, right? It's just the vote against part that got added in. What Citizens United mattered for, and what the good governance groups don't want to tell you it mattered for, is what it said about corruption. And so this goes back to just the very beginning of our discussion. Remember the quid pro quo discussion. It used to be when you regulated, you were thought to be regulating to prevent quid pro quo corruption. You know, I'll give you money and you give me a vote. Over time, the liberals on the court began to expand what corruption meant. And they began to, because when Congress regulates under the First Amendment, it has to have a reason, and the reason has always been corruption. So the liberals started to say, corruption isn't just I give you money, you give me vote. It's the notion that the donors are calling the tune. That's just a Souter's phrase. Or even the perception that the donors are calling the tune. And the thing is, if you are regulating based on the perception of corruption by the American people, you can always regulate. Because the American people always think there's corruption in their government, so it's a very easy system, and you can pretty much do whatever you want in the name of corruption. What Citizens United did, and what was important about it, and what has mattered, is it narrowed the definition of corruption. Because Justice Kennedy wasn't a fool. He knew exactly what his colleagues on the left were doing, and he narrowed the definition of corruption far, far more constrained definition, almost down to quid pro quo corruption and not much else, as a justification for campaign finance. So why does that matter? It matters because if you can only regulate the you give me money, I give you vote rule, then all of these so-called independent expenditures, which are just people spending without coordination with the party or the candidate, those are not corrupting. Justice Kennedy says, as a matter of law, those are not corrupting. And then someone says, but the people who are spending money on that are actually getting better access to politicians. And Kennedy says, and what I think is the most important sentence of that opinion, ingratiation and access are not corruption. Now, if ingratiation and access are not corruption, then there's a lot of things you can't regulate. And sure enough, in the wake of Citizens United, we've seen one regulation after another fall, and hence we see super PACs. Hence we see a lot of the independent spending because of that ruling. Now, the good governance groups won't tell you that, because they want to go to Congress and tell Congress they can regulate going forward. But the lawyers who actually read the opinion will tell Congress, yeah, you can regulate, but much less than before. That's what I think is true of Citizens United. So, I mean, I don't blame the Goo-Goos. Their life is impossible. Why not latch on to something, the one thing that people pay attention to, the one decision American people noticed, but it's just flatly wrong in terms of the way they analyze it.
Right, but the one of the things that it seems to me that they focus on, of course, is the wrong part of it as well. The idea that corporations are persons for the purposes of the First Amendment.
Yeah.
And corporations, of course, are artifacts, they're not persons. And why would anybody think a corporation is a person? So the reason it's wrong has something to do almost with the metaphysics of it.
Yeah. No, Mitt Romney did say that corporations are people too, but the Supreme Court did not.
Right.
And corporations had long had the ability to spend in elections, so this was not something that new from Citizens United. But the other real problem for this version of what's wrong with Citizens United, this is like a parlor game. What's wrong with Citizens United? Every time I go do a talk, I get a long speech about what's wrong with Citizens United with a question mark at the end. But one of the speeches is this, and the trouble is that, and this is why it's so hard, being a lawyer is being a spoil sport, because you just shatter at one illusion after another. So inevitably, someone on the Hill decides they want to regulate that part of Citizens United, and they want to say corporations are not people, whatever it is. The trouble is, when you start to regulate corporations, you start to regulate all the nonprofits. You start to regulate cities and towns and churches. Everything is a corporation. Mitt Romney is actually kind of right on this one. There's a lot of corporations that are just small groups of associations, small groups of people. And so it makes it very hard to fix the Citizens United problem if that's what you think is the problem.
Right. So let me ask you if you would like a closing statement to make before we turn this over to questions. People, tell us a little something about your vision of the future. I know that you like dirty politics, and you also like political theory. The thing that comes to mind is I think it's okay to like both dirty politics and political theory. It's just that you must be some sort of romantic to believe that the dirty politics is not just compatible, but conducive to good policy or good political theory, good decision-making, good representation, it doesn't seem on the face of it that there's a story, a mechanism to be told.
Yeah.
What's the mechanism for you?
So I'll say two things. So one is, most people who write in political theory about American democracy write as if there's just an individual who votes and participates and is represented and thinks through these things, and that's all wonderful. They don't think about groups. They don't think about interests. They don't think about the rough and tumble politics. They don't think about things like winners and losers. And I think those are important things to think about. But here's my vision of American politics. I think it does two things. Democracy does two things in our country. So one, it's a profoundly integrative force. It brings everyone together, forces them to compromise with one another under these giant big tents. People always complain about having no choice in American politics. It's just, well, that's called compromise. You're giving two sets of compromises and you have to choose among them. It pulls outsiders in along every dimension because outsiders want to have power. So that's how you pull them into the system. So that's one of the things American politics does. But American politics always happens at two levels. So there are interests that drive the arguments and frame the arguments. But when you frame the arguments, you don't say, I want this because I want big oil to win. You don't say this because I want my special hometown to benefit because you're going to get a high-tech center here. So that even though self-interest fuels it and gives it a lot of energy, it's framed in a way that's designed to appeal to people, and people are basically decent. You have to believe that people are politicians are never decent, but people are decent. That's my divide. And so when you frame issues that way, you have to appeal to the other side. You have to appeal to something that people actually are proud to vote for. And that combination is a really amazing combination. If it were just about framing it, no one would watch it. It would be completely boring, and there would be no one pushing it. Because it would be about what you see in faculty, right? A bunch of academics. We spend all kinds of time telling you what the right answer is, and nobody reads our stuff.
If you were to fast forward 5-7 years from now, how does this end? I mean, it's in many ways, I think about this kind of the shadow party, super PACs. You saw it in the last election. It's going to get bigger and bigger. As the Republicans are raising big funds, so are the Democrats. You think about Grover Norquist and what he's trying to do and taking hostage the Republican Party. It seems like it's going to end badly. Do you have a different view? And also, if you could comment on Grover Norquist and just how does he fit in? I think, if anything, he is the personification of kind of the party elite, and he's got a lot of money behind him. Would like your comments on that too.
Yeah, so on the how does it end, I mean, I do think that it's going to be a while before it ends, because I just don't see any incentives for either side right now to fix the problem. So usually you get election reform when one party believes it's in its self-interest to reform. Or when the incumbents think it's in their self-interest to reform. So the one thing that Democrats and Republicans can often agree on is that they should remain in power. And that they should do everything they can to stop challengers from the outside. So you'll see regulation then. You'll see regulation when one party gets in power and thinks that something's to their benefit. But right now, it's not clear to me. The Republicans did much better on the money front than the Democrats, but the Democrats are gearing up. And they will catch up, I'm confident, by the next election, because that's just how it always works. People always catch up. So in 2016, I expect an evenly matched system. With even more money flowing into the system. That would be my guess. So what else? Is that good for democracy? No, I mean, I think the shadow parties are damaging to democracy. I'm very, very worried about them. So this is not a cheery. I'm very cheery about politics, but I'm not cheery about this. There are better and worse forms of politics, and I'm very concerned about the development of the shadow parties. I think it's a problem. So what could change it? A controversy. So that's typically has something that just gets so ugly that people actually pay attention. The other thing is there's a very interesting reform group that is trying to do primary challenges. So primary challenges are what scare the bejesus out of every politician. Politicians almost always win the general election. But primary challenges are small, and you can organize a group of people pretty effectively. So there's, the thing that is making the Republican Party shift to the right is not the general election. It is the primary challenge. Every Republican who's moved to the right, from John McCain, or who has left, like Olympia Snowe, it's all because of fear of primary challenges. So there's a reform group, a campaign finance reform group, that has stopped with the good governance strategy of saying, please, please pass reform. And they say, we're going to challenge you in the primary. So that could work. But otherwise, it's hard to see where the end is. And I actually am quite worried about it. I think it's a real problem.
Thank you very much indeed. Very illuminating and insightful, really. You wrote a book before, a year ago or something like that, on democracy index.
Yes.
How does this reflect on the reform which you propose on shadow parties and on such groupings? The other question is a small one also. You have an uproar now on issue areas, like, for example, oil shale, and that would make apparently Obama is very enthusiastic about the independence of oil. How does that reflect itself in the domestic scene with the things which you mentioned about the shadowy parties, or with the elites, for example, power, money trailing powers, and the lobbies in America, the lobby system?
It's really, I feel like you guys are academics. Everyone asks two questions.
Right.
On the first question, the democracy index actually has more to do with election administration than this part of it. It's about ranking states and localities based on how well they run their elections, because the other dirty secret of American politics is that our elections are extremely badly run. Compared to most other well-developed democracies. They're run by partisans, and they're run by, in a highly decentralized fashion, in an under-resourced fashion. So that proposal was created in the hope of jump-starting reform in that area. And I'm happy to say that on Tuesday, as I was flying to Abu Dhabi, the Pew Center, the Pew Foundation created the first election performance index. So it was very exciting. On the second one about, I'm not sure if I could tell you really what's going on with oil and in politics, in part because its influence is very hard to trace. You can see it in legislation when any industry does well or does badly. You can see it in the administrative agencies, but you don't know where the money's coming from, because if you're Exxon, you're not going to run an ad from Exxon. You're going to run an ad from Americans for America, which is I used to use that in class as a joke, and then I realized it actually was the name of one of these organizations. So I mean, one of the hard things about creating one of these super PACs nowadays or a nonprofit is all the good names are taken, including Americans for America. So so that's how they run, and so it's untraceable. It's you just can't find where the money goes, and so we don't really have a good answer to the question of which industries are influencing American politics and which aren't.
Thank you. I wonder if I can get your opinion on a specific issue. I'm thinking about the recent, well, not so recent anymore, a New Year's deal on the fiscal cliff, which seems to be a perfect example of how the same thing can be seen completely different. On one hand, you had the camp that says this is great. This shows that democracy actually works. When the stakes are up, the parties get together, they hammer out a deal to save the country. And then you have the other camp who say it's a total disgrace and shows how dysfunctional the American democracy is. The country is facing a disaster, and all the politicians can do is agree to kick the can down the road for another couple of months. I wonder where would you be on the scale there?
Yeah, I mean, I actually. So you have to. I start with a very low expectation of what's going to happen. So I often think that they're going to bring us right into chaos. So the fact that they didn't seems kind of a cheery result to me. But I think that what you describe, the Red Sox versus Yankees rivalry here, has become so deeply embedded in American politics. The funny thing about political scientists, and I'm always teasing them about this, is for 40 years they said we need strong parties. We need parties that are disciplined and vote together and have the same message and so on and so forth. And now we have them, and be careful what you wish for. Because everyone reads things through party ID nowadays. So on almost every issue that's been politicized, Democrats and Republicans have diametrically opposite views of what's happening about the same set of facts. And there's very little crossover. So what you need to get a fiscal cliff deal is someone who's willing to give. And the parties have become so disciplined that there are fewer and fewer people willing to give. In the old days, when the parties were fractious, when they had these coalitions that didn't really fit well together, there was a lot of crossover and a lot of giving and a lot of compromise. But that's just not true anymore, and it's paralyzed us because we have a presidential system, nominally with our institutions, but right now our parties look like the kinds of parties that you see in a prime minister type system, right? Where you win everything, winner take all. So it would be perfectly fine with the parties we have now if you win the presidency, you also win the Senate and the House, because then you could just get stuff done. But right now we have a fractured party system. We have a system where you can have veto gates everywhere, and with disciplined parties, veto gates mean that nothing gets done. It's very hard to get deals like the fiscal cliff deal. I am in the camp that it's not a great policy. It's not a great policy, but it's better than I thought. The political science question is always as opposed to what, and on my as opposed to what might have happened. Yes, it could have been a lot worse. Exactly.
It seems obvious that money matters in politics. You need to hire a campaign, pay for ads, but it obviously doesn't determine everything. There's incumbency effect, the state of the economy, and some people are just, Democrats or Republicans, and they won't vote for the other person no matter how many ads they see. Is there much empirical evidence on the actual impact of money on elections, and what does that research suggest?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the answer is that money, to quote the great political philosopher Cyndi Lauper, money changes everything. Money matters along a variety of dimensions. So you can't run a campaign without money. I actually had someone come into my office saying that he wanted to start a third party. And I said, oh, well, that's great, because now the way the money works, you can just get some quadrillionaire to fund it and you'll be fine. He goes, oh, no, we'll never take a donation over $99. It's like, you're never going to get anything, right? So you need money. But there is a point where money stops mattering because you need enough money to get the ads going and to shape views. But at some point, people's views get set and the money actually has very little effect. That being said, I will say there's kind of a meme in American politics right now. which is that somehow the money that the Republicans spent didn't matter. And they're constantly saying that the money didn't matter. Look, they lost all these races. They made a bad bet. Don't bet against the Obama campaign, right? But the money mattered so powerfully. So I remember in February, before the election, when we all met in Chicago, the lawyers all met the staff, the money that the Republicans were going to spend profoundly shaped the way the campaign was run. The Democrats knew that they couldn't win the airwave game because they just were never going to get as much money as Republicans, so they went for a ground war. No one ever won a ground war campaign until 2012. It just doesn't happen. But the Obama campaign's social networking, data-driven stuff actually they figured out a way to do it. But even the way that the Obama campaign spent its money, it made a bet that it would brand Romney. They were sure he was going to be the nominee. They spent a lot of time branding him as someone early on. That money mattered because by the time Romney came out of the primary, he was labeled as somebody because of the money the Obama campaign spent. And it didn't matter how much money he spent later, he was labeled. So money matters. It matters tremendously. But it's not like you can guarantee the person with more money is the one who's going to be the winner.
Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting lecture here. But I like to let you know at this point that I am an old-timer professor in economics. And when I used to go with my team to evaluate a project, and we use shadow pricing, the first thing we do, we define shadow pricing. What is the definition of shadow money and shadow parties?
Yeah.
If you don't mind.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So dark money means the money spent by organizations independent of the party or the candidate, and funded in a way that is non-transparent. That is, you can't tell who's putting the money into the organizations. That's dark money. Shadow parties is simply to say it's something that looks a lot like a party. It has the basic features of a party with the exception of the party faithful and running a candidate. So it has the same kind of organization, the same sort of media strategy. It does the same kinds of things as a party. But it's not a political party in the formal sense. It's not going to be able to get its candidates on the ballot. It's supporting the party that's getting candidates on the ballot.
What's your thought on why is it not the case in the United States that there are more than two parties? Because we see in other parts of the world lots of parties, and they win seats. In the United States, the Green Libertarians and others have not gotten any traction for the longest time. So what's your thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the major features of American politics, which is different from most other places, is that we don't have a cumulative voting system. So we have a system by which we elect people in districts. And just to give you a sense of it, I mean, just imagine there's a line here across the stage, and you want to pick a candidate, you want to be a candidate, and we want to get a lot of voters. So ideally, Jules and I would sit here, so I'd be close to people on the far right and close to people in the middle right, and Jules would sit over there. And he'd be close to the people on the far left and close to people in the middle left, and everyone would be happy with who was representing them. But then I think to myself, oh, Jules is sitting over there. So I take my chair, and I scooch over, and I sit here. Oh, and the mic guy is going to tell me, I told you I would not do that, and I did it. So I scooch my party over, and suddenly I've taken all the voters here. And Jules is just stuck with the lefties over there. That's how American politics works. So what happens is both Jules and I know exactly what we need to do is we need to move to the middle. And that's why you have two parties. A third party can't do anything. A third party is going to get this piece here or that piece there, but we are in the middle and we're going to get more voters. That's why third parties don't develop in the United States for the most part. But we used to actually have a lot of different kinds of parties. There were usually two parties in a system, but they were different parties. So you'd have libertarians in some places. In San Francisco, there is a Green Party because San Francisco is much more progressive. But those, because of the integration of local, state, and national politics, because that good housekeeping seal of approval is so powerful, once the national parties became real brands, everyone wants to run as a Democrat or Republican because it just guarantees you a bunch of votes. And that's why you don't see, even at the state and local level, any differentiation, because people are using that national brand.
So, as an American from Arizona, I've yet to find the mysterious swing voter that this money, which would purportedly change their mind, feels like kind of like they're a unicorn. Most people actually know who they're going to vote for going into the election. So really what you end up with the question is how much of my base am I going to get out? How much would a compulsory voting system, like you see in Australia, affect the way in which money affects American politics?
It's an interesting question. So I'll say a couple things. It is in fact true that the swing voter is becoming a vanishing breed. So the percentage of people that Obama and Romney were competing over was 12% roughly. That's a tiny percentage of the electorate, much smaller than it's been in past elections because people are so politicized. So a lot of it is about getting your folks out. The other thing I'll just say but here's what I'll say about the undecided voter. So there's a swing voter, and then there's an undecided voter. And if you're a political scientist, if you want to get political scientists really riled up, say something nice about the undecided voter. So when CNN always does these panels, here are the undecided voters. It's the week before the election, and they're still undecided. How can you be undecided, right? There was this great riff by Jon Stewart about McCain and Obama. One's liberal, one's conservative, one's black, one's white, one's young, one's old. We know who they are, but undecided voters are voters who don't know much about American politics. So it turns out a lot of voters don't know much about American politics. Many people can't tell you that we have a Senate. Many people can't tell you who's in control of the House. Just very basic questions about American politics people don't know. Now, they overcome that by voting Democrat or Republican, right? They vote a brand, and that's how they sort of overcome their complete ignorance about the system. But those are the guys, at least, that get up and vote. You have a compulsory voting system, and what you're doing is you're bringing in people who really pay no attention at all, that may not even know there's an election and certainly don't care enough. If they don't care enough to go cast a ballot, it's not clear they're going to care enough to read a newspaper and figure out anything. So the compulsory ballot is likely to put in a lot of what the political scientists hate, which is the undecided voters. Now, it may not matter. It may be that they'll just do the same thing everyone else does, which is kind of vote using the shorthand, and it may just kind of reproduce itself. But I get nervous about it only because at least the people who suit up and get in the game are aware that there are parties and that they are different and that they ought to cast it, think about that. Which I know that sounds pretty basic, but I'm happy with that, given what people don't know about American politics.
I'm wondering about the root cause of the changes that we see in politics. Could it be related to the changes in income disparity? And could there be a circular relationship between, concentration of wealth and then creating money flow, which creates policy, which, creates a downward spiral?
It is political scientists have a bunch of theories about why we've become so polarized, and you've just named one of the main ones. So there's a big camp of political scientists who say that it's income inequality that's really driving the disparities among the parties and moving things. Other people think it was race. That is, in the olden days, the Republican Party included New England Republicans and Western Republicans, and the Democrats included Southern Democrats and urban democratic machines in the North. And but when the Civil Rights Revolution came, it realigned the South. And so now everyone in the South is Republican. It's astonishing. Every state legislature, I think every governorship but one is controlled by the Republican Party, and they're very cohesive. So that has changed fundamentally the way politics works and made the parties more cohesive on both ends, because the New England Republicans are now gone as well. So no one really knows the answer, but income inequality and the changes in the workforce have been one of the main arguments about what shaped it.
What's interesting, of course, is from a certain point of view, you'd think income inequality and race would track comparably, but they actually, in this way, they tell completely different stories.
Yeah. No, there's a funny thing about, the truth of the matter is that a white Baptist in the South and a black Baptist in the South agree on a lot more stuff than the black Baptist in the South agrees with the liberal in a city in the Northeast. But that's the one group. African Americans vote at a huge rate for Democrats, and not just for Obama, the number was phenomenally high. But Democrats call African Americans gold when they're doing redistricting. So why do they call them gold? It's because they're such steady voters for the party that they want to have them in their districts because they're good, steady Democratic votes.
Mm-hmm. What's the view about Latino vote going forward? So
what's interesting about Latino voters in the United States is that they're varied. Right. In California, Latinos are heavily Democratic, and that is in large part because there was a governor in California who decided to run on immigration issues and polarized the state. And as a result, Latinos in California, They don't believe in the Republican Party, and not all of them, but they vote heavily Democratic. Places like Texas, they are swing voters. They vote for both groups.
And in Florida?
In Florida, you have Cubans, and they vote heavily Republican, although I will just say the Obama campaign had a bunch of numbers. Their numbers were astonishingly accurate. If you're an election junkie, the only place that beat Nate Silver was the Obama campaign. They knew their numbers so tightly. But the one number that they didn't catch was that actually Cubans in Florida voted for Obama, which has never happened. So even that group is shifting. And the real question for the Republican Party is if they continue to drive on immigration issues in a certain kind of way, are they going to flip Latina voters into California Latina voters? So they won't be swing voters, but they'll be heavily Democratic voters going forward. And that's a huge question for the party right now.
So my question is about one effort that campaign finance donor reformers are pushing for, which is public financing. And I'm just wondering if you think that's a prospect that people think is helpful and states can adapt.
I think public financing systems are very helpful, particularly the ones that take the form of helping small donors, matching small donors, and creating an incentive for politicians to reach out to people who aren't quadrillionaires. The dilemma of public finance nowadays is that no one wants to pass it. So we're in a fiscal, a position, a budgetary crisis in almost every state. And very few politicians are interested in going to voters and saying, you need to help me fund my campaign. We're going to put some money aside so you can fund our campaigns. It's just, voters are completely hostile to that idea right now, and politicians are very nervous about it. So the systems that exist now are getting defunded, but are still there. But no, it's very hard to get a new one passed, despite all the brouhaha right now over campaign finance.
Okay, I guess my question is more about the checks and balances that you could impose on, I guess, the laws around guarding the guardians of the parties, as you call it, the party faithfuls. Like, what kind of checks and balances would you even start to suggest to kind of save that the only true members of the party?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because a lot of these things are informal mechanisms of influence. One of this is, again, the instinct of most academics, and particularly law professors, is to go for formal regulation all the time because they think that's the way power runs. But power often, and influence often runs through these informal channels, and those matter a lot. So I think that really the only way to protect the party faithful is to get rid of the shadow parties because as long as everyone's under one big tent, all those avenues of influence and connection exist. And all the sort of norms that develop when you interact with people on a day-to-day basis in a tightly networked system, those are the things that give the party faithful their influence. It's not a vote. It's not the ability to write the party platform, which is totally meaningless. It is those informal networks that matter. And the only way to create those is to create an institutional mechanism by which the informal networks only take place under one tent rather than two. So I think that's the only way that I can think of to do it.
I hope you all join me in thanking Heather Gerken for a fabulous discussion.
Thank you very much.